Hi, my name is Kristen Christman, and I'll be reading the second half of Part 2. So Part 2B. I've begun reading the 7 parts of this essay, which is called Paradigm for Peace Applied to Russia, Ukraine, and the U.S. Proposal for a Peaceful Pathway Forward. And what I do in this essay is I apply a model that I created right after 9/11. The model is called Paradigm for Peace, to the current crisis in Ukraine, in the hopes that this model can give some insight and ideas for a nonviolent pathway forward. So we're looking at the roots of violence, and the first of category we're looking at is needs for life and safety. And this is the second part of that, where we're going to be looking at the far right-wing ultranationalist violence in Ukraine. And countercurrents.org is kindly publishing this entire essay, so if you'd like to read it or look at the sources, the endnotes are all on countercurrents.org. Some Ukrainians have feared for their lives and safety because of Ukrainian extreme right-wing violence, a form of violence that seems to be aggressive and clearly criminal, since the targets of its violence appear to often be unarmed and nonviolent. Groups such as the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the Svoboda Party, the Freedom Party, which used to be named the Social National Party, Right Sector, Azov Battalion, C-14, the police regiments Dnipro 1 and Dnipro 2, and the Tornado, Donbass, and Idar battalions are all linked with fascism and far right-wing violent extremism. Andrei Parubi, the co-founder of Svoboda and Patriot of Ukraine, whose members became the core of Azov Battalion, reportedly regularly meets with Washington, D.C. think tanks and politicians. As an aside, note that some consider fascism to be left-wing rather than right-wing. It's true that the very word Nazi comes from the words National Socialist, and the word socialist implies left-wing. However, others argue that while the Nazis were socialist in name, they were not socialist in action. In fact, the first groups that Hitler attacked and imprisoned were the left-wing political groups, socialists and communists. Typically, communism and socialism are considered left-wing, and fascism is considered right-wing. For purposes of this essay, well, I'll continue to call them right-wing. It doesn't matter to me whether you want to consider them left-wing or right-wing. A simple two-dimensional left and right-wing line might not even be the best way to think about political viewpoints. But most importantly, my point in calling them far right-wing is not to disparage the right-wing, or to suggest that the violence of the far right-wing is due to their being on the right-wing. It's due to their being far, which also doesn't necessarily mean violent either. Left-wing violence and left-wing dictatorships, such as that of a communist totalitarian dictatorship, and right-wing violence and right-wing dictatorships, such as life under Chile's Pinochet, are both horrendous, and they both violate the principles of left-wing and right-wing individuals who do not believe in such violence, dictatorship, or totalitarianism. Violence and aggression should be addressed with caring and concern, and without bias, whether it is far left-wing or far right-wing. The deeper point is to address these groups, their aggressive ideas, their violence, and also their fears and grievances, no matter which side of the political spectrum they fall. Perhaps in addition to the left-right horizontal line, it would be more meaningful and purposeful to also draw a vertical line running through it and extending from cooperative, egalitarian nonviolence at the top to dominating hierarchical violence at the bottom, so that there are 4 quadrants. Hopefully, whether we're left or right, we can aim for the top. It's important to note that not all people in these groups are neo-Nazis, and perhaps some have views that are distinct in significant ways. Most or all of these groups do not formally embrace Nazi ideology. In fact, members of these groups have often vociferously denied that they are neo-Nazis. The label only angers them, and they explain that they are Ukrainian nationalists. At the same time, many of the groups do include some neo-Nazis in their membership. For example, in 2015, a spokesperson for the Azov Battalion stated that 10 to 20% of Azov's recruits were neo-Nazis. The Svoboda Party supposedly expelled its neo-Nazi members when it was trying to transform its image and change its name from the Social National Party to the Svoboda Party in 2018. On my essay, I wrote National Socialist Party, that they used to be called, but I reversed the words. It should say Svoboda used to be the Social National Party. Perhaps a better term than neo-Nazi for these groups would be fascist, since Nazis are more specifically associated with Hitler's Third Reich, and perhaps many of these far right-wing Ukrainians care much more about Ukraine than Hitler. I don't know. An excellent article about the defining beliefs and fears of fascists is written by Dan Tamer, When Jews Praised Mussolini and Supported Nazis. Meet Israel's First Fascists. The article lists these defining characteristics of fascism: conviction of superiority of one's group, a feeling of victimhood, feeling justified to commit any form of revenge, subjugation of the individual to the group, and belief in the supreme leader as having extraordinary, even divine or supernatural powers. Many also would include as a characteristic a repulsion to left-wing policies. While fascist beliefs are intolerant, ruthless, and violent, they appear to be goaded simultaneously by convictions of superiority and by fears and convictions of victimhood. Not mentioned in the article is the idea that fascist governments are defined by some as existing when a strong, undemocratic tie exists between government and big business, so that government and businesses collaborate in harmful ways to serve each other's purposes. To my knowledge, such collaboration is not something that's being promoted by Ukraine's far right-wing violent extremists, who seem extremely angered by the stealing, dishonesty, and corruption within government, and the disproportionate power of oligarchs within the nation. Many articles refer to Ukrainians' violent far-right wing simply as ultranationalists, and this may be the very best term for them, a type of extreme nationalism that includes violence and hatred towards those who are not of their ethnicity. But again, I don't have access to any type of survey of these groups, and I don't know whether they all look down on others or not. Most of all, it's important to listen to the particulars of their beliefs. It would be a disservice to smear an entire group with the ideas and actions of its most violent and intolerant members, who may not even be representative of the entire group. In fact, in situations of conflict, this tactic called pathological stereotyping, of defining and perceiving an entire group by the most repulsive behaviors and actions of unrepresentative members, is a tactic that only heightens misunderstanding and places harmony and reconciliation even farther out of reach. Of course, just because a group isn't neo-Nazi doesn't mean it's harmless, nonviolent, and just. It could be highly prejudiced, fascist, and violent, whether it's neo-Nazi or not. With regard to U.S. foreign policy, it's critical to understand that U.S. weapons and funding are helping, either intentionally or unintentionally, to support the behaviors of these violent Ukrainian extremists. It's reportedly difficult to keep U.S. aid and weapons from ending up in the hands of these groups. Yet these groups are not representative of the Ukrainian population as a whole. The Svoboda Party, for example, won 10% of the vote in 2015, and that was much more than it had ever gained. In supporting these groups more than others, therefore, U.S. policymakers can hardly say they're supporting democracy within Ukraine. In fact, it's impossible to help one side kill another side in a foreign nation civil war and call that assistance democratic and supportive of that nation's population. Democracy involves caring for all, not obliterating the side that you disagree with. For this reason, Biden sending weapons to Ukraine is an extremely undemocratic gesture. U.S. policymakers try to make it seem democratic, as if the other side of the Civil War is really a bunch of Russian puppets, but that's not the truth of it. With regard to the dangers from these groups in Ukraine, several articles, especially Lev Galinkin's highly informative article in The Nation, provide much evidence. Human rights groups, including Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the UN, have reported and condemned rising far right-wing paramilitary violence in Ukraine, including attacks on women's rights marches, the LGBTQ community, and several attacks on the Romani, Gypsies, who were also the primary target of Hitler's Nazis in terms of percentage of the ethnic group destroyed. The UN has accused the Azov Regiment of violating international humanitarian law. Azov's infliction of rape and torture in the Donbass region of Donetsk and Lugansk is documented for the years 2015 to 2016. Yet right-wing extremists from several nations on 3 continents, including the United States, have traveled to Ukraine to join with Azov. In 2018, the far-right group C14 drove away a Romani community, chased Romani women and children, and burned down their tents. A few months later, using batons and other weapons, they attacked a Romani community, injured several, and killed one young Romani man. C14 was originally the youth wing of the Svoboda party. The 7 suspects in the murderous attack were aged 16 and 17. The UN insisted that Kiev cease persecution of the Romani, but months later, a human rights group reported that C14, in collaboration with Kiev's police, was allegedly intimidating the Romani. Well prior to the 2014 coup, the BBC reported that Svoboda Party activists attacked and sprayed tear gas at a gay rights rally in Kiev. The party also was calling for a requirement that passports specify the holder's ethnicity. Meanwhile, at the start of the civil war in 2014, the IDAR Battalion, referred to as a neo-Nazi battalion, fired weapons at a monastery and held 300 monks and other civilians hostage. Amnesty International has documented cases of abuse it states were committed by IDAR in 2014 and are classified as war crimes, including extorting money, abducting, and beating Ukrainians suspected of collaborating with pro-Russian Ukrainians. IDAR's leader himself honestly admitted, "I don't deny people were looting there in eastern Ukraine." The Tornado Battalion as well was accused by Ukraine's government of including about 40 members who have criminal records, though the types and severity of the crimes committed are not stated. The 2015 article states that 8 members had been accused of crimes including rape, forcing captives to rape another man, murder, and smuggling. As Medea Benjamin and Nicholas J.S. Davies of Code Pink explain, the extreme right-wing Svoboda Freedom Party played a major role in Ukraine's 2014 coup. The peaceful protests against the corrupt administration of President Viktor Yanukovych turned into violence thanks to the armed behavior of the extreme right-wing right sector. Russ Bellant, who has written about the ties of right-wing Nazi collaborating Eastern European immigrants with U.S. Republican Party campaigns since the 1950s, has stated that the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, an intolerant, violent organization from the 1920s that backed the all-Ukrainian 14th Waffen-SS Division during World War II, is behind the Svoboda Party, a party supported by the U.S. government, and a party that was a force within the 2014 coup. In stating the reasons for Russia's invasion, Putin referred to this violence and to the war crimes of Ukrainian extremists, but U.S. media makers called his grievances phony. Putin referred to the inhumane blockades which prevented Russia's humanitarian aid from reaching Donetsk and Lugansk. Russia also claimed that Kiev cut off utilities, including water, to the republics. Again, U.S. politicians and their obedient media makers dismissed these fears as phony. This denial of Putin's and Russia's fears is the same callous, dehumanizing disrespect for another's fears, and the same denial of suffering, assault, and violence that has been present toward the victims of other forms of U.S. prejudice, including prejudice against women, against Native Americans, Asian Americans, and African Americans, as well as less recognized forms of prejudice within our systems and institutions, against the rights and dignity of children, employees, and the non-wealthy. A truly evolved society is one which can recognize its own prejudices, not merely in hindsight, but in the present. When groupthink and mainstream media are at their zenith in applauding prejudice, and particularly in times of conflict when prejudice is harnessed and fueled to justify violence and injustice against certain people deemed evil, dangerous, and morally inferior. When people truly think someone else is dangerous and malicious, prejudice, itself dangerous, suddenly seems moral and is allowed to grow, like cancer, disguised as good but actually taking over one's cells. While U.S. policy and media makers have been busy drowning truth in the stew of their prejudice, in 2014 Amnesty International accused the Dnipro 1 Battalion of war crimes, including the use of starvation of civilians as a weapon of warfare. Amnesty also accused Dnipro 1 of blocking humanitarian aid. An Amnesty International official also described as a war crime the actions of the Dnipro, Idar, and Donbass battalions in blocking food and clothing to Donetsk and Lugansk, regions where more than half the people depend upon food aid. Galinkin reports that 6 months after this accusation, U.S. Senator John McCain visited Ukraine and praised Dnipro 1. Articles from German and British news sites reported on Ukraine's attacks in 2014 that damaged a power plant in Donetsk, thus cutting off access to water, and on Ukraine's cutting off the electricity supply and funding to the republics in 2017. So Putin's claims are validated, they're documented by these human rights agencies. In addition to the blockades of food, water, electricity, and humanitarian aid, in addition to the physical attacks, abuse also comes in the form of symbolism. The use of Nazi symbolism, such as swastikas and swastika-like symbols, has been on the rise. Galinkin refers to an explosion of swastikas. Statues and streets have been dedicated to Ukrainians connected with the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, who massacred thousands of Jews and Poles and collaborated with Nazis during World War II. Right Sector, who formed the most militarized parts of the 2014 coup, included demonstrators who wore anti-Semitic symbols. At the same time, Jewish Holocaust memorials, Jewish centers, and Jewish cemeteries have been vandalized, and at least one synagogue has been firebombed. Verbal abuse against minorities has also escalated. Galinkin reports that torchlight marches celebrating Nazi collaborators have become a routine feature under the post-coup Ukrainian government. In a march in 2017 honoring Stepan Bandera, the former leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, thousands chanted, "Jews out!" Other forms of verbal abuse, such as by right-wing members of parliament, have been coarse, vulgar, and threatening towards minorities, such as Jews and Russians. One politician, Galinkin reports, regretted that Hitler hadn't annihilated the Jews completely. These remarks and these statements of goals are made without repercussions. Hatred against Russia has become venomous amongst far right-wing extremists. One article reported that a Ukrainian man was attacked simply for speaking Russian. In 2015, Reuters quoted a member of the St. Mary's Battalion who stated that he'd like to create a Christian Taliban to reclaim eastern Ukraine and Crimea. Quote, "I would like Ukraine to lead the crusades. Our mission is not only to kick out the occupiers, but also revenge. Moscow must burn." End of quote. And remember, he said this in 2015. In 2012, the European Parliament passed a resolution asking Kiev not to associate with the Svoboda Party due to its racist, xenophobic, and anti-Semitic views. But after the 2014 coup, Svoboda Party members were appointed to about 1/4 of the cabinet positions in the interim government. One Svoboda Party member even assaulted a Ukrainian state TV station merely for broadcasting a speech given by Putin. In 2014, NBC reported that the party's goals listed on its website included preserving Ukraine's national identity, protecting Ukraine's living space, the lingo used by Hitler, and criminalizing any displays of Ukrainophobia. In other words, it's okay to be fearful and even hateful and violent towards Russians, Jews, feminists, and gays. But it's not cool to be fearful, hateful, or violent towards heterosexual, male, ethnic Ukrainians. Israel itself has publicly requested Kiev to stop the epidemic of anti-Semitism. In 2018, the World Jewish Congress, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and 57 members of the U.S. Congress denounced this Nazi glorification and anti-Semitism emanating from Kiev. Galinkin reports that, while many Ukrainian Jewish leaders supported the anti-corruption protests in 2014, 41 Ukrainian Russian leaders have since condemned the growth of anti-Semitism. The connections between violent far-right extremists, including neo-Nazis, and Ukraine's government and legal apparatus are disturbing. Neo-Nazis work in Ukraine's police, National Guard, and military, which is said to be the reason why far right-wing violence in the streets is given impunity. The Azov Battalion was incorporated into Ukraine's National Guard in 2014 to become the Azov Regiment. Shortly after the 2014 coup, the U.S. began equipping and training Ukraine's National Police, which is under the jurisdiction of Ukraine's Minister of the Interior, a cabinet post given to Vadim Treya, a veteran of Azov and patriot of Ukraine. Volunteer battalions have received some of their weapons from Ukraine's defense ministry and others from oligarchs. Al Jazeera's article states that Petro Poroshenko, Ukraine's president at the time, praised Azov when it was integrated into the National Guard in 2014 as our best warriors. Yet, while the post-coup Ukrainian government seems to have directly supported these groups and has also been accused by human rights organizations of ignoring their violence, at the same time, at least back in 2015, the post-coup Ukrainian government itself saw many of these volunteer unofficial battalions or certain criminal members within them as problematic. The Reuters article from 2015 pointed out that President Poroshenko stated that these illegal groups must disarm because they're threatening to make the country even more unstable than it already is. He also stated that groups could not be both politically involved in government and also militant. They could only be one or the other, presumably because militant vigilantism in Ukraine is allowed only in order to support Ukraine's police and protect the Ukrainian population as a whole, not a particular political party. The Ukrainian Minister of the Interior and Ukraine's military prosecutor were both intent on weeding out the criminal elements within these volunteer battalions and prosecuting them for crimes. However, as the article from 2015 reveals, hostility has occurred between these far right-wing groups and the Ukrainian government and police. Extremists are angered that the revolution of 2014 has still not been completed and that corruption still exists. They've also been angered by the government's attempt to dismantle them. Right sector and the police even had a shootout. Far right-wing extremists poured manure in front of the office of Ukraine's military prosecutor. Now, I don't know if this conflict between the far right-wing groups and Ukraine's government and police is still existing now, but it was existing in 2015 for sure. While the Ukrainian government is accused of collaborating with neo-Nazis by bringing the Azov Regiment into military service, it's possible that this is part of an attempt to control Azov. The 2015 Reuters article states that the Ukraine government, in an effort to bring IDAR and other volunteer battalions under control, ordered IDAR to reform into the 24th Assault Battalion as part of Ukraine's official forces. In 2015, IDAR members were lighting tires on fire in front of Ukraine's Department of the Interior in protest of government attempts to disband them. Therefore, incorporating them into official forces may have been an attempt to disempower their criminal elements while empowering their non-criminal elements and get them more in line. Even Poroshenko's praise could have been intended to be aimed at the non-criminal aspects of Azov as a way of helping them to feel proud of being a part of the official forces and more inclined to stay non-criminal. But I don't know. I don't know the full context of his comment. Clearly, ultranationalist violence has been an enormous, complicated problem for many in Ukraine. Since U.S. media is so one-dimensional and narrow in scope, it's not clear that U.S. weapon shipments are something that most Ukrainian leaders would even advocate, given the consequences of building up the violent capabilities of far right-wing extremists. Nonetheless, with brazen falseness and stuffing its ears to Putin's, Israel's, Ukrainian civilians, and the Ukrainian government's severe concerns, with callousness that denies the suffering of victims of neo-Nazi and other far right-wing violence, American experts deny the whole problem by first inflating these accusations of neo-Nazism and far right-wing extremist violence into an accusation that the entire government of Ukraine is neo-Nazi, and then by rejecting that accusation as ridiculous. So-called U.S. experts persist in educating Americans by uttering with unwarranted confidence the simple-minded argument that it's impossible for Ukraine's government to be neo-Nazi or to collaborate with neo-Nazis because Ukraine's President Zelensky is Jewish. Infographics, which repetitively derides Russia and Putin with relish throughout the program, a program filled with inconsistencies and some falseness, mocks Putin's accusation of neo-Nazism within Ukraine's government by stating that the idea of a Jewish president leading a Nazi government is, quote, not only blatantly false, but ridiculous. The tone of the narrator is meant to assure us that infographics has accurately explained Putin's concerns and validly denied its foundations. Other U.S. experts and scholars also dismiss neo-Nazism, claiming it is no more a problem in Ukraine than in any other nations. They seem to forget that the neo-Nazis and other far right-wing extremists in Ukraine are being armed with U.S. and NATO heavy weaponry to fight on the front lines in Donetsk and Lugansk. Moreover, Ukraine is the only nation in the world with a neo-Nazi formation in its armed forces. And if neo-Nazism has no more power in Ukraine than any other nation, then why were Ukraine and the U.S. the only two nations that voted against the February 2022 UN resolution to condemn the glorification of Nazism? In his July 2021 essay, Putin points out that Ukraine has repeatedly voted against past attempts to pass this resolution. In 2022, the resolution was passed, with 130 nations voting in favor. 51, including the entire European Union, abstained. And only 2 voted against it, Ukraine and the U.S. The U.S. supported its decision by falsely claiming that the resolution was a thinly veiled attempt by Russia to serve as fraudulent cover for its actions in Ukraine. This denial of neo-Nazi violence, vandalism, and symbolic verbal and physical abuse is maddening. Perhaps U.S. policymakers should speak with the human rights groups and the victims of assault, rape, and robbery that have condemned neo-Nazi violence in Ukraine. With its typical spineless sense of morality, the U.S. government briefly forbade U.S. support and training to Azov in 2015, but then lifted the ban in 2016 under some sort of unknown pressure from the Pentagon. U.S. foreign policy is always made by pressure, not by informed cooperative thought and discussion, and we never really learn what that pressure is. The very presence of the Azov Battalion on the front lines of war in Donetsk and Lugansk is yet one more factor that provoked Russia to invade Ukraine, to protect Ukrainians from horror. Nonetheless, with a sense of logic matching its sense of morality, U.S. policymakers decided that Azov, whose violent presence was helping attract a Russian invasion, wasn't so bad after all, since it was fighting the invading Russians. Of course, perhaps U.S. policymaker logic is the same as U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski's logic in 1979. Arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan is a great idea because it will provoke the Soviets to invade and get mired in their own Vietnam. And 6 months after the U.S. began funding the Mujahideen, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. It seems U.S. policymakers are going to extremes to both support neo-Nazism and other forms of far right-wing violence, and also to deny its existence as a significant force in Ukraine. A behavior so peculiar that it deserves more attention. The use of President Zelensky's Jewish ethnicity as proof of the lack of neo-Nazism as a force in Ukraine's government and society is illogical on many levels. Illogical. Of course, it's understandable that Americans equate Nazism solely with anti-Semitism, since that's pretty much all that's emphasized in the U.S. We certainly don't learn about Hitler's viciousness towards socialists, communists, Romani, and Slavs in general. Such knowledge would not have been conducive to fueling American Cold War anti-Soviet fear and hatred. And we certainly don't learn about Jewish fascism as it exists in the form of Jewish revisionism. Beginning in the 1920s, Jewish revisionists, perhaps psychologically traumatized by their own family backgrounds, experiencing pogroms in Eastern Europe, believed in the necessity of the ruthless use of force to achieve their goals of Israeli statehood. Ironically, Jewish revisionists admired Hitler and sought to collaborate with the Axis powers to rid themselves of Britain's attempts to equitably manage and remedy the fact that enormous numbers of impoverished Arabs were not only being economically threatened by rising Jewish immigration, but were being pushed out of Palestine. So while Britain was attacking Nazi Germany, which was slaughtering Jews, the Jewish revisionist Irgun, at one point led by future Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and the Stern Gang, at one point led by future Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, launched terrorist campaigns against British personnel and Arab civilians. The Irgun was a political predecessor of today's Likud party in Israel, strongly supported by U.S. policymakers, who in turn received financial contributions from pro-Likud lobbyists of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC. Ukraine's President Zelensky is not necessarily fascist. He could simply be under pressure to cooperate with the extreme right wing. But the point in mentioning this aside about Jewish fascists in Israel is to prove even further that this U.S. expert claim that a Jewish president cannot exist or even collaborate with neo-Nazis within the same government is false. So you have to wonder, if this U.S. expert claim is false, what else is false? And why are Americans making up false stories? Is their argument against Russia and against Putin too shaky to stand on its own without lies? Ukrainian fears for life from attack by far right-wing violent extremists, both before and after the 2014 coup, are valid fears that deserve attention, not denial. At the same time, as we follow the Paradigm for Peace model, which entails seeking to understand and analyze the defensive and aggressive roots of violence on all sides of conflict, we must also learn whether these far-right groups, including neo-Nazis, have feared for their own lives and safety. One of the worst things to do to people is simply to condemn them, without even trying to understand their fears and their point of view. It's also poor human relations to condemn an entire group based upon the worst behavior of its members, if those members' actions are not representative of the group's typical behavior. We need to learn whether these ultranationalist groups hold legitimate grievances, or even certain legitimate aspects of grievances that should be addressed. For example, why do these groups attack the Romani? Is it possible that any members of these groups have been threatened in major or minor ways by the Romani? Were ultranationalists' lives threatened, or property, or feelings? If so, were the offending Romani acting typically for Romani, or were they more poorly behaved than most? If so, why should an entire camp be attacked? To what extent are attacks on Romani simply a way for ultranationalists to fulfill certain psychological needs that are otherwise unmet, such as needs for identity and superiority? Can we talk about this? And in this section where we listen to the fears of far right-wing extremists, in this essay here, this part 2, which is in the category of life and safety, we're talking about fears for life and safety. So the ultranationalists do have other fears pertaining to power and corruption, but we'll talk about those fears in other parts of the essay. For those grievances that prove to be largely illegitimate, irrational, or immoral, we need to figure out which forces and circumstances in culture created those perspectives. For these people, while inflicting suffering upon others, seem to be suffering in their own way. So much rage and hatred must be difficult to endure. And be sure not to confuse sending weapons to these groups with solving these groups' problems. For the weapons are not solving their problems, and are only making them capable of worse crimes, which will in turn make their cause and their very existence appear even more illegitimate. In her work, Women of the Klan, Kathleen Blee shows how Ku Klux Klan members in the 1920s truly thought of themselves as good people. It's important to understand this and find out why. Highly prejudiced, violent extremist groups such as the KKK do have underlying fears, not necessarily about their lives, but often about their economic security, values and morality in society, their social standing in society, and their personal value. They tend to irrationally blame their problems on entire categories of people, of certain ethnic groups, religions, or socioeconomic classes other than their own. Without excusing or supporting right-wing or left-wing extremist violence and callous hatred, we've got to listen to their fears and see if they possess certain legitimate grievances that can be alleviated, or simply irrational fears that also need to be addressed with caring. In order to understand why right-wing Ukrainians honor Ukrainians who collaborated with Nazis during World War II and massacred thousands of Jews and Poles, we might also try to understand the rational and irrational fears of those World War II Ukrainians, such as the all-Ukrainian SS unit who committed the murders. Is it possible that these Ukrainians felt, correctly or not, that their lives were endangered by Jews and Poles? If so, to what extent was this feeling a result merely of propaganda? In the course of my research and writing, I've run the Paradigm for Peace model through the circumstances of Nazi Germany, and it's easy to see that German Nazism emerged from severe threats to life, power, wealth, land, love, worth, and respect from World War I, from the Treaty of Versailles, the Great Depression, and unequal international relationships of power, wealth, and trade. Nazi views about Jews and communists and German convictions that Hitler was a man of peace, fighting on the defense against aggressors, resulted from heavy, lengthy doses of propaganda. Not only that, U.S. banks, law firms, and businesses directly helped build up Hitler's arsenal. To what extent were Ukrainian Nazi collaborators during World War II, and to what extent are ultranationalist Ukrainians today experiencing these same types of threats, these same types of propaganda, and these same types of access to weapons? To what extent are Americans? To what extent are U.S. policymakers, media makers issuing propaganda that makes Americans think it's moral to kill Russians, to commit a coup against Putin? It's when people feel they're so moral and self-righteous that they're capable of so much cruelty because they think they're on the side of the divine. So that's why I'm saying you've got to find out, why did these Ukrainians kill the Jews in massacres? What was going on in their minds? Were they being duped in some way or confused? And are we being duped and confused? We want to watch out for this kind of a thing. It's not that those people were just, by nature, evil people. What happened to their minds could happen to our minds or anybody else's minds. Obviously, the point is not to understand the Ukrainian Nazi collaborators to the point of agreeing that Jews and Poles should be murdered or that certain people are inferior. The point is to discover how these extremists have felt threatened, even if only psychologically, even if only as the result of propaganda, in order to help them today feel physically, emotionally, socially, and psychologically safe without having to resort to violence or injustice, in order to help prevent people from ever experiencing such fears and frustrations, and from ever feeling the need to respond to fears and frustrations so violently, much as the U.S. policymakers do. As repulsive as it might seem to various people to try to understand neo-Nazis, or Russians, or U.S. policymakers, it's critical not to exclude any group from our efforts to understand fears and hopes and the forces in society that have shaped these minds. While all fears cannot be remedied in conflict resolution and cooperative negotiation, especially since many may originate in the physical and emotional insecurities of childhood dynamics, school and community dynamics, or personal biologies, and while perfect understanding and harmony is impossible, these efforts, unlike weapon corporation-sponsored efforts and good guy killing evil guy efforts, could actually move us forward instead of backward. Moreover, if some American, Ukrainian, or Russian fears are more irrational and are rooted not in actual current threatening circumstances, but rather more deeply in the stress, trauma, threats, frustrations, or alienation of childhood or community dynamics, in the skewed information developed by propaganda, or in the skewed mentalities festering within certain organizational cultures. Such an analysis can point to the need for reforms in society's priorities and traditions of human relations to help humans grow and develop with much more social and emotional security, caring, and friendship, and with respect for the truth as something to seek, not contort. Thank you very, very much. That concludes Part 2B, which concludes the section on needs for life and safety and how feeling threatened, feeling that one's own life or the lives of one's loved ones are threatened, contributes to violence. And there will be there's 7 parts to this essay, and they're all in the process of being published on countercurrents.org. Thank you very, very much.